Rain fell hard the night everything between us changed forever. She ran across the street without an umbrella, chasing me. "Take my coat," she said, breathless. Refusing to take no. I froze. Coat in hand, staring into her steady eyes. She didn't leave. She just stood there, watching me. That night I learned her name. Sloane Ridley. A stranger. 6 months later. I would lose everything because of her. But I would also finally learn who I really was. My name is Dana Whitfield. I grew up in Asheville, North Carolina, in a family where church attendance mattered more than happiness, and rules replaced questions. I taught 2nd grade at Mount Hebron Christian Academy, engaged to a man my mother adored, living a life that looked perfect from every angle but mine. The night we met, I'd left my umbrella at school, cursing myself as thunder cracked over the grocery store parking lot on Haywood Street. A woman jogged toward me through the downpour, holding her denim jacket over her head like a makeshift shield against the storm. "Here," she said, draping it over my shoulders before I could protest, water dripping from her dark hair onto the pavement between us. I asked her name. She smiled and said, "Sloane. I just moved into the loft above the bakery on Lexington Avenue last week." I offered to return her jacket, and she handed me a business card instead, printed with a camera icon and her phone number. For 3 days, I told myself I wouldn't call. On the 4th day, I ordered a coffee near the bakery, hoping to see her. She was there. Camera slung around her neck, photographing steam rising off a stranger's cup. She waved like she'd been expecting me. We talked for 2 hours about nothing important, and somehow it felt more honest than any conversation I'd had with Caleb in months. She was a freelance photographer, recently arrived from Chicago, chasing quieter light and slower mornings in the Blue Ridge Mountains. I didn't tell her about Caleb, my fiancé, or the wedding date already circled in red on my mother's kitchen calendar. When she laughed, something in my chest loosened that had been tight for years, though I couldn't yet name what it was. I went home that night and sat in my car outside my apartment for 20 minutes before I could make myself go inside. We started meeting for coffee every Thursday. An arrangement I told myself was simply friendship between 2 women who liked the same bakery. Sloane asked questions no one else did, not about the wedding, but about what I actually wanted from my own life. I found myself thinking about her during faculty meetings, doodling camera shapes in the margins of my lesson plans without noticing. She showed me photographs she'd taken of the mountains at dawn, and I realized I'd never really looked at anything that carefully before. Caleb noticed I'd been distracted, and I blamed it on stress at school, hating how easily the lie came to my mouth. One Thursday, Sloane touched my hand while reaching for the sugar, and neither of us moved away for several long seconds. I started wearing the earrings she'd once complimented, then felt foolish and confused about why her opinion suddenly mattered so much. She invited me to her loft to see her photography, and I said yes before my brain caught up with my mouth. Her apartment smelled like developer chemicals and cedar candles, walls covered in black and white portraits of strangers caught mid-laugh. We sat on her floor eating takeout, and she asked, gently, "Are you happy, Dana?" Really happy. Not just fine. No one had asked me that in years. I didn't answer. I just started crying. And she didn't try to stop me. She held my hand while I cried, saying nothing. And I understood then that I trusted her more than I'd trusted anyone. I left before midnight, terrified of what I felt, terrified that Caleb would see it written across my face. That week I canceled 2 Thursday coffees, telling myself distance would fix whatever confusion had crept into my carefully ordered life. Sloane texted only once. No pressure. "I'll be at the bakery if you ever want to talk." I read it 11 times. I lasted 5 days before I walked into that bakery, heart pounding, unable to explain even to myself why I'd come back. She looked up from her camera and smiled like she'd known I would return, which somehow made it easier to sit down. We didn't talk about what had happened at her apartment. We just picked up exactly where we'd left off. Careful and quiet. My engagement ring started to feel heavier on my hand, a fact I noticed while grading spelling tests one rainy Tuesday afternoon. Sloane began photographing me without asking. Candid shots of me laughing or reading, and I loved seeing myself through her eyes. One evening she showed me a photo of myself I didn't recognize, someone lighter, someone who looked genuinely unguarded and free. "You look different in this one," she said quietly. "Like yourself." I didn't know how to tell her she was right. I started making excuses to drive past her building, telling myself it was on the way to somewhere I actually needed to go. Caleb proposed we move our wedding date up. I said I needed time to plan. What I really needed was time to think. Sloane and I hiked to Craggy Gardens one Saturday, and at the summit she reached for my hand without asking permission.
Illet her holdet.
The mountains blurred. My pulse roared in my ears, and for once I didn't calculate the consequences. "I like you, Dana," she said plainly. "No games. No hedging. I think you already know that. I think you feel it too." I told her I was engaged. She nodded slowly and said, "I know. I've known since the day I gave you my coat." "Then why?" I started, and she cut me off gently. "Because I saw something in you that I don't think you've let yourself see." I drove home in silence, gripping the wheel, replaying her words until they blurred together with the sound of my own heartbeat. That night I lay beside Caleb and studied the ceiling, wondering when exactly I'd stopped feeling anything when he touched my hand. I realized I'd never once felt with him what I felt standing on that mountain, breathless, holding a woman's hand in the wind. I avoided Sloane for 2 weeks, burying myself in wedding invitations and seating charts, hoping busyness would smother the truth rising in me. She never pushed. She sent one photo, the mountain view from Craggy Gardens, with no caption, just a reminder she was waiting. I finally admitted to myself, alone in my classroom after the last bell, that I was falling in love with a woman. The realization didn't feel like collapse. It felt like a window opening in a room I hadn't known was airless until then. Called Sloane that night. She answered on the first ring, as if she'd been holding her phone, waiting for exactly this call. "I need to tell you something," I said, voice shaking. "And I need you to just listen until I'm finished." "Okay." I told her everything, the years of performing happiness, the engagement I couldn't explain anymore, and the feelings I could no longer deny. She was quiet for a long moment, then said softly, "Whatever you decide, Dana, I'm not going anywhere. Take the time you need." For the first time in my adult life, someone had offered me patience instead of pressure, space instead of expectation. I met Caleb for dinner and tried to explain, fumbling for words that wouldn't hurt him but couldn't disguise what was actually true. "Is there someone else?" he asked directly, and I nodded, unable to lie to his face anymore, even to soften the blow. He didn't yell. He just stared at his plate and asked one question. "Is it who I think it is?" I said yes. Word traveled fast in a town our size, and within days, my mother called, her voice tight with a fear I recognized instantly. "Tell me it isn't true, Dana," she said. "Tell me you haven't thrown away everything we built for some phase." I said nothing. My silence was answer enough. She hung up without saying goodbye, and I sat on my kitchen floor for a very long time. Sloane came over that night, not to comfort me with words, but simply to sit beside me while I fell apart quietly. "I'm scared," I admitted, and she said, "Good. That means it matters. Numb people don't get scared. You're finally feeling something real." For the first time, I let myself imagine a future that had nothing to do with my mother's approval or Caleb's ring. Monday morning, the school principal called me into his office, a manila folder already open on his desk before I even sat down. "There are concerns," he said carefully, "about your personal choices, and whether they align with our school's Christian values statement. I asked who had reported me. He wouldn't say. But I suspected it was Caleb's mother, who taught kindergarten down the hall. I was placed on unpaid leave pending review, a phrase that sounded gentle but hollowed out my paycheck and my sense of safety. My mother invited me to Sunday dinner, then spent the entire meal reciting scripture at me instead of asking how I was doing. My father said almost nothing, staring at his plate, and I couldn't tell if his silence meant disapproval or something more complicated. Sloane's own family situation surfaced that same week. Her mother in Chicago had been diagnosed with early-stage Parkinson's disease. She started making weekend trips home, and each time she left, I felt a small, cold fear that she wouldn't come back. My best friend since childhood, Renee, stopped returning my calls, her silence louder than anything my mother had ever shouted at me. I discovered, through a mutual friend, that Sloane had once dated my cousin Whitney in Chicago, years before either of us knew the other. Whitney called me, furious, accusing me of stealing someone from her past, though she and Sloane had ended things amicably years earlier. The tangled coincidence made our small town feel smaller still. Every relationship suddenly a thread connected to some other painful knot. Caleb's mother started a prayer chain for my soul, and I began receiving anonymous scripture texts from numbers I didn't recognize. At the grocery store, people who once greeted me warmly now looked away, or worse, stared with open, unashamed curiosity. I lost my part-time position tutoring at the community center too, the director citing parent complaints without further explanation. Sloane offered to help financially, and I refused. Some old pride refusing to let my relationship become a debt I couldn't repay. I applied to 6 other schools. 5 never called back. The 6th rejected me after checking. I later learned, with Mount Hebron, my mother left a voicemail saying she'd been praying for God to deliver me back, as though I were lost, not simply myself. I played that voicemail 4 times, then deleted it, unable to decide if I felt more angry or more heartbroken. Sloane's mother's condition worsened faster than doctors expected, and she flew to Chicago for what she said might be an extended stay. I have to go, she told me at the airport, eyes wet. I don't know for how long. I'm sorry, Dana. I told her to go, that I understood, though watching her walk through security felt like watching my only anchor drift away. Alone in Asheville, jobless and half estranged from my family, I questioned whether I'd traded a comfortable lie for an unbearable truth. My father showed up at my apartment unannounced one evening, holding a box of old photographs I'd never seen before. Inside was a picture of a young man who looked like my father, standing beside another man, arms around each other's shoulders. That's my brother. Your Uncle Raymond, he said quietly. The family disowned him in 1974. I never spoke up. I've regretted it since. I stared at him, stunned, as he admitted he'd spent decades watching his own father's cruelty repeat itself in my mother. I'm not going to make that mistake twice, he said. I don't understand everything, Dana. But I understand losing you isn't an option. It was the first time in my life my father had ever said something that sounded like an apology and a promise combined. His support gave me one steady place to stand while everything else around me seemed to be crumbling piece by piece. Sloane called nightly from Chicago, her voice thinner each time, exhausted from hospital visits and her mother's slow, frightening decline. I offered to fly out to be with her. She said no, gently, insisting she needed to handle her family alone for now. The distance between us stretched thin, and I began to wonder if she was quietly, kindly, preparing to let me go. Renee finally called, not to apologize, but to warn me that people at church were saying cruel things I hadn't yet heard. I stopped attending Sunday service altogether, the building that once felt like home now feeling like a courtroom built against me. Caleb, surprisingly, texted to check on me, saying he didn't hate me. Just wished I'd told him the truth sooner. His kindness undid something in me. Proof that decency and heartbreak could exist in the same person at the same time. I picked up shifts at a diner on Marymount Avenue. Embarrassed at first, then oddly grateful for the anonymity of the work. A regular customer, an older woman named Pearl, told me one morning, unprompted, "Whatever you're carrying, honey, you're carrying it well." Small kindnesses from strangers started to matter more than the silence from people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. Sloane's texts grew shorter and further apart, and one week, they stopped entirely, leaving me checking my phone every 20 minutes. I called her twice with no answer, panic rising as I imagined every terrible possibility for her sudden, total silence. On the 9th day of silence, I received a text from an unfamiliar number. "This is Sloane's sister. She asked me to reach you." My hand shook reading the message. "Our mother passed away this morning. Sloane isn't doing well. She asked if you'd come." I booked a flight to Chicago that same afternoon, using savings I'd been keeping for a wedding that would now never happen. I found Sloane sitting alone on her mother's porch steps, camera untouched beside her, staring at nothing in the gray afternoon light. She looked up at me, disbelief crossing her face. "You came," she whispered, as though she hadn't quite let herself hope for it. "Of course I came," I said, sitting beside her. "You said you're not going anywhere." "Neither am I." "Not this time." We sat together in silence for a long while, her head eventually resting on my shoulder as the streetlights flickered on above us. That night, holding her while she grieved, I understood love wasn't the mountaintop moment. It was choosing to stay through the hard part. We returned to Asheville together 2 weeks later. Both changed. Both carrying losses that had somehow bound us closer instead of apart. My mother heard I'd flown to Chicago for that woman's family, and called it the final proof that I'd abandoned everything she'd taught me. She announced, at a family gathering I wasn't invited to, that she would no longer discuss me unless I came to my senses. My father secretly kept me updated on family news, a quiet rebellion that cost him arguments with my mother I never fully witnessed. Whitney, my cousin, unexpectedly reached out again, this time to apologize, admitting her anger had really been about her own unresolved history with Sloane. She and I talked for hours, and by the end, she offered something rare, genuine understanding instead of old resentment. Sloane, still grieving, threw herself into a photography project documenting queer families across western North Carolina, calling it her mother's unfinished wish. She asked me to be part of the project, not just as her partner, but as one of the subjects she photographed. Standing in front of her camera, no longer hiding, felt like the opposite of every year I'd spent performing someone else's version of me. The project gained local attention, and a gallery in downtown Asheville offered to exhibit the photographs, including several featuring the two of us. My mother learned about the exhibit through a neighbor before I could tell her myself, and her fury reached a new, sharper edge. "You're making a spectacle of our family," she said on the phone. "Everyone will know. Everyone will talk." I said, "Let them." That single sentence, "let them," felt like the first time I'd ever truly stood up to her without apologizing afterward. Philip, unexpectedly, showed up at the gallery opening, standing quietly at the back, and later told me he was proud of my courage. His presence, forgiving rather than bitter, closed a wound I hadn't realized was still open between old love and new understanding. Mount Hebron's school board, facing pressure from parents who supported me, reopened my case, citing insufficient grounds for the earlier suspension. I was offered my job back. After everything, I sat with the offer for 3 days before deciding what I truly wanted. I declined the position, choosing instead to teach at a public elementary school across town that had reached out after hearing my story. The decision felt less like rejection and more like finally choosing a room where I didn't have to shrink myself to fit. My mother sent one final message. I love you, but I cannot support this. I read it standing in my new classroom, alone. I didn't respond right away. For the first time, I let myself grieve the mother I wished I had instead of forcing forgiveness too soon. Sloane found me crying in the classroom after hours and simply sat with me, understanding that some griefs don't need fixing, only company. A month later, my father asked to meet Sloane properly, over coffee. Without my mother present or aware of the meeting at all. He shook her hand and said, "Thank you for bringing my daughter back to herself." Sloane cried. I had never seen her cry before that. That meeting became a quiet turning point, proof that healing in my family, however partial, was still somehow possible. Renee finally apologized in person, admitting her silence had come from fear of her own church community, not from any real judgment of me. I forgave her. Understanding fear was a language I knew intimately, one I'd spoken myself for most of my adult life. Sloane's photography exhibit drew regional press coverage, and a reporter asked to interview us both about love in the modern South. I agreed to the interview, surprising even myself with how naturally the truth came out once I stopped fighting it. The article ran with a photo of us at Craggy Gardens, the same mountain where she'd first told me how she felt. My mother saw the article. She didn't call, but my father told me she'd cut it out and kept it unread in a drawer. I chose to believe that small, silent act meant something, even if she wasn't ready to say so out loud yet. Sloane and I moved in together that spring, into a small house near Beaver Lake, the first home either of us had chosen freely. Unpacking boxes together, I found the original denim jacket she draped over me the night we met, still folded in her closet. "You kept it," I said, and she smiled. I knew, even then, that jacket wasn't just about the rain. We hosted a small housewarming, inviting Renee, Whitney, my father, and a handful of new friends from the photography project community. My mother wasn't invited, not out of spite, but because I finally understood some doors have to stay closed until someone else opens them. Sloane proposed to me on the porch of that house. No cameras. No audience. Just a simple ring and a simpler question. I said yes before she even finished asking, laughing through tears at how certain I felt after years of doubt about everything except her. We told our families separately. My father cried happy tears. My mother's response was 3 words. I need time. I accepted that answer. Planning a wedding the second time around felt entirely different, lighter, truer, built on choice instead of obligation or expectation. We decided on a small ceremony at Craggy Gardens, the mountaintop where everything real between us had actually begun. 2 weeks before the wedding, my mother called, her voice unsteady. "I've been talking to your father's brother's old friend," she said. She explained she'd tracked down someone who remembered Uncle Raymond, someone who told her how much the family's rejection had cost him. "I don't want to lose you the way we lost him," she admitted quietly. "I don't understand it, but I don't want to lose you." It wasn't full acceptance, but it was a door cracked open, and I decided that was enough to walk through for now. She asked, hesitantly, if she could come to the wedding. I told her yes. On one condition, she had to actually try. She agreed. And for the first time in over a year, I heard something in her voice that sounded almost like hope. The morning of our wedding, Sloane and I stood at the trailhead where she'd first held my hand, mountains stretching gold beneath the sunrise. My father walked me partway up the trail. My mother stood waiting near the top, hands folded, uncertain but present, which was enough. I saw her first, my mother, standing among our small circle of guests, looking as out of place and as brave as I once had. Sloane waited at the summit in a simple ivory dress, camera abandoned for once in favor of just being fully present in the moment. As I climbed the last stretch of trail, I passed my mother, who reached out and squeezed my hand without a single word. It wasn't an apology. and it wasn't full understanding. But it was the first time she'd touched me warmly in over a year. I reached Sloan at the summit, wind pulling at both our dresses, and I finally understood what people meant by feeling wholly seen. The officiant, a friend from the photography project, began the ceremony with the words Sloan had chosen. Love is not a phase. It's a foundation. I recited vows I'd written in the diner during slow shifts, promising to choose honesty over comfort for the rest of my life. Sloan's vows mentioned the coat, the rain, and the 6 months of Thursdays that taught her patience was its own quiet form of love. Midway through the ceremony, my mother stepped forward unexpectedly, asking if she could speak, her voice trembling in front of everyone gathered. I don't understand all of this, she said, but I understand my daughter is happier than I've ever seen her. That has to matter. She placed a small, worn photograph in my hands, Uncle Raymond, smiling. A man she'd apparently kept hidden away for decades out of guilt. I should have fought for him, she said. I won't make that mistake with you. The wind seemed to hold still around us. Sloan squeezed my hand as I cried. The photograph pressed between our palms, 3 generations of silence finally cracking open on a mountaintop. The officiant continued, and my father read a passage he'd chosen himself, not scripture this time, but a simple poem about second chances. When the officiant pronounced us married, the small crowd erupted, and even my mother, hesitant, clapped along with genuine, surprised tears. Sloan kissed me at the summit of Craggy Gardens, cameras from our small guest list capturing what her camera alone once couldn't. Belonging. Renee caught the moment on video, later telling me it was the first wedding she'd ever cried at that wasn't even her own. Caleb sent a card that arrived the next week, simply reading, I'm genuinely happy for you both. You deserve this kind of love. We drove home as a married couple, the denim jacket from that first rainy night still hanging, absurdly, on our coat rack. That evening, my mother texted a single photo, the old picture of Uncle Raymond with the caption, I'm framing this. Finally. It wasn't everything. She still struggled with certain words, certain conversations, certain church friends who whispered when my name came up. But she started coming to Sunday dinners at our house, awkward and quiet at first, then gradually a little more herself each visit. Sloan's photography exhibit toured 3 more cities that year, each showing including the wedding portrait taken at Craggy Gardens Summit. I returned to teaching, this time openly, hanging a small photo of our wedding on my classroom desk without a second thought of hiding it. A student once asked who the woman in the photo was. I said, simply, that's my wife, and the classroom didn't blink. That ordinary moment, unremarkable to an 8-year-old, felt like the quiet miracle I'd spent years afraid I would never get to have. Whitney and Sloan became genuine friends again. An old wound fully healed, proof that time could rewrite even complicated histories kindly. My father framed a photo of the 4 of us, him, me, Sloan, and my mother at the wedding, displaying it proudly at home. A year later, my mother asked if she could join Sloan's project, offering to be photographed alongside other families learning to understand their queer children. Sloan agreed, and the resulting photograph, my mother's hands folded, eyes uncertain but present, became one of the exhibit's most talked about pieces. The caption beneath it, written by my mother herself, read simply, I am still learning. I am still trying. I still love her. I framed a copy for our hallway, a reminder that growth, even imperfect and painfully slow, still counted as something real and true. Uncle Raymond, we later learned through a record search, had passed away years earlier, but had a partner who still lived in Nashville. My mother wrote him a letter, an apology decades overdue, and he wrote back one line, better late than never. Thank you. That exchange, small and quiet, seemed to loosen something in my mother that years of arguments with me never had. Sloane and I began fostering a Thursday coffee tradition of our own, inviting other young queer couples struggling with families like mine had once been. We called it Coat Night, after the jacket that started everything, a small community built from rain, patience, and one stubborn kindness. Looking back, I realized the bravest thing I ever did wasn't coming out, it was choosing, every single day afterward, to stay myself. 3 years after that rainy night on Haywood Street, I still keep the denim jacket, worn soft, hanging by our front door. Some nights I catch Sloane looking at me the way she did that first evening, like the storm had brought her exactly where she belonged. Fendi.